Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, or wherever, or evening, depending on where you might be. Welcome to day two of our Zoom conference, The Art of Armor. 3 days talks about all things armor related to benefit History Live Northeast. I'm Matt Blazik, Executive Director of History Live Northeast, and I am really excited this morning to introduce our first speaker today for the first session. This is someone whom I have followed for, I don't even know, from basically the beginning of my career of being interested in armor and reenacting and all that stuff. I'm so happy and excited he could be here today to do this for us. Dr. Tobais Capwell, the curator of arms and armor for the Wallace Collection in London. Dr. Capwell, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So you're going to talk today about something that's been near and dear to you for quite a while here, this book project that you've gone on.
Yes, I thought because it's one of the most recent major things that I've done, I thought people might be interested to know a little bit more about where the project came from and what it involved and what I was trying to do and how it kind of took over my life really. And the first book came out in 2015, which was a while ago. There's a lot of people who were here for that, but there's plenty of people who have gotten interested in arms and armor since then. And for them, the second recent book covering the period 1450 to 1500, which came out last October, that's really their introduction to it. I've had a lot of people who pick that book up and then say, wait a minute, there's another one, there's an earlier one, and they kind of have discovered more of the project that way. And then I thought, as well as all of that, we can mention briefly that there's a third book that's nearly finished and is going to be coming out in the autumn as well. Some of my longer term, followers will be a bit incredulous because, the first book, came out a comparatively long time ago, and the follow-up took a long time. But the third one's coming right after, so we can explain why that's happening that way as well, and just whatever people are interested in knowing more about, really.
I have the first book of this series. I absolutely love it because it covers specifically the time frame that I reenact when I'm out doing things. I completely love the section where you talk about like the standing collars, the steel collars, because for the longest time I had to try to convince people, it's like, no, I think they really do, they do exist. And it's like, they're like, oh no, that was just a Laurence Olivier made up thing for the movie. And I'm like, no, I've seen artwork and things. So I now when everybody says that, I just open your book and I say, ha ha.
Page 87. Or whatever.
So this is something you said. This has been something you've been working on for as it says in the title, 25 years.
Yeah, 25 years. I started thinking. Well, let's just we can start with some sort of illustrated help here. For me, arms and armor was a childhood fascination that just sort of never went away. And I joined the Royal Armories in Leeds in 1996 when they first opened the new museum there. And one of the things that had always struck me about the subject, looking at surviving material, our study of armor begins with the actual armor that survives. You study what we might refer to as the material evidence. But in one way or another, it's not a complete picture. Very often we're presented with things like this, which give us a fascinating glimpse of what a Western Europeans or Iberian man-at-arms might have looked like in the 1480s or something. But there's a lot of the picture missing, and sometimes when you go further back in time, you're dealing with things like this. A fragment of a gauntlet. It's a lump of iron oxide, and it's a big it's a great big leap
Mm.
of imagination and research and faith and everything else to get from what survives of that 14th century armor to, what it was like when it was new. And my instinct with the subject had always been, the equipment, the study of antiquities and whatever is all very well, but I want to get closer to the real human experience.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, I wanted to be a knight, not a curator in a museum. And kids don't want to read things; they want to do things.
Yeah.
I wanted to get on a horse and I wanted to fight, and the reading about it is important too. But there's this practical, hands-on, living, empathic kind of aspect to this, that you want to know what it was really like, but that's really difficult.
That's very true. My son's really into Egypt right now, and I've had to stop him digging holes in our backyard.
Yeah,
He,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
so you're right about that.
So when I joined the armories in the mid '90s, I didn't join as a curator initially. I was, training and riding horses and jousting in their tilt yard, and that was my into museums. And I quickly got involved in curatorial work, and I became a curatorial assistant, and I went back to graduate school to start collecting the qualifications that I needed. Um, but I spent a lot of my spare time at work in the library at the Royal Armories, which is of course one of the greatest arms and armor study libraries in the world, and as well as all the books and manuscripts and everything, they had this amazing photo archive of these 8 by 10 black and white prints, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, that had been taken on research trips by people like Claude Blair and AVB Norman, and the great scholars of the 20th century had all been associated with the Royal Armories in one way or another. And I started going through their files, and it was like following their adventures in this pictorial way.
Yeah.
And they'd looked at a fair amount of effigies, and the effigies immediately grabbed my attention and my imagination, because there's about 10 15th century effigies, English effigies, that are in all the books that everybody knows. If you crack a book on the Wars of the Roses or whatever, there are a small number of these things that you expect to see in all the books. But there are 230 15th century effigies of men in armor thereabouts, and the vast majority are not published, and they're unknown outside, local history societies and whatever. And I started seeing things that I could never have imagined from that point in my studies. And I always have found effigies particularly captivating, because it's not just the armor sitting in a glass case, it's the person. They're there with all of the accoutrements that the armor is meant to go with, the mail and the surcoats and the livery collars, and it feels like a more complete human picture. So I really wanted to pursue that. And when it came time to come up with a PhD subject, my advice from my professors was, when you pick a PhD subject, try to pick something that you feel certain you're going to be able to work on for years without getting bored of. At various points, you might, you go through various phases of your relationship with your subject, but you've got to be sure this is something you're really intensely committed to. And I had the sense that, that was the case here. And also the appeal of the PhD subject of a comprehensive study of the effigies, and then an analysis of what they tell us about armor. It offered me the chance to have a great adventure across the British Isles. I spent 2.5, nearly 3 years on the road, driving, tens of thousands of miles around the country, I've probably gone to over 600 medieval churches
Oh, wow.
across England and Wales, which is still only a small percentage of the total number.
Have you been to the one at how do I pronounce it? Ulme, the one that the Thomas Chaucer's tomb? I got a thing for Thomas Chaucer. I'm
Oh yeah. Ulm. Yeah.
Ulm, yeah, yeah.
Or Ulm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I have been there. I've taken a picture of the brass, and they have a fantastic monuments and wall paintings. The wonderful thing about this is it gives you a mission. It's like a nightly quest in a way, and you go off to places that you would never think to go just off the top of your head. When you're sitting on the couch, thinking about where shall I go on holiday, these are not the places that will come to mind. But when you have to go to these places with these strange names because there's a medieval sculpture in there somewhere that you have to find, it's an adventure. I spent 2.5, nearly 3 years doing that, and I found these monuments in all kinds of different circumstances. Some of these churches are constantly used, and they've been constantly upgraded and renovated and changed around. And now there's a little kids play area in one part of it, and they're living spaces. And then others are basically medieval churches that were shut in the 16th century and never touched afterwards. And there's no pews, and the medieval tiles are all still there, and there's still church helmets on the walls in some cases. It's amazingly variable. It also really opened my eyes to considering the whole circumstances of a work of art like this. That when we've got a specialist interest like armor, it's very easy to kind of go in with blinders, and you approach a work of art like this, and you're kind of in danger of mining it for the information that you think you're after. And I think it's important to beware of the impulse to mine art and literature for information. I think it's better to kind of approach a work of art or a work of literature or whatever, to approach it as what it is meant to be, and kind of let it speak to you first. And that way you get the information about the armor, but it comes in a fuller kind of context. Because you need to understand the people who made this stuff, and you need to understand what they believed and what they were trying to achieve. And when you look at what monuments were really about, and you understand the mindset of the people who created these things, it actually gives you much greater confidence that when you look at an effigy like this, you're looking at a genuine effort to represent reality. Because that's a major issue when I'm approaching armor with effigies as a major source of evidence. The first question that anybody would be quite right to ask is, well, how do you know these things are accurate? How do you know that the carver isn't just making up whatever he wants? And how can you prove that there is a desire to represent reality, that a priority of this artwork is the accurate, technical, visual representation of real armor that actually existed, versus just a kind of vague impression of an armored body? That's a fundamental question. And again, when you just look at the monuments for what they are and kind of soak them up, they give you greater and greater confidence. You don't have to work very hard to see that what these people are doing is kind of profound and extraordinary. I mean, when you look at fine details, the intention of the carver, the interest in the carver to render very fine details with a kind of physical fidelity, it's there. The way they want to show you those arming points that have been tied in a very specific way. They want to show you that when it passes through a plate, they've got a little grommet or a little eyelet there to make sure the plate doesn't saw through the point. And just the way the rivets are placed and the way different materials lay over each other, and the behavior of straps, and when a strap goes through a buckle and then comes through, and how the different materials behave under the illusory effect of gravity. They sometimes will show a strap falling as if it was being influenced by gravity. So they're really concerned that the effigy has this kind of, gives the illusion of a real armored body laying there in front of you.
What do you think? What do you think drove that concern?
Well, you have to look at what effigies actually are. Why are they making this thing? What is this meant to be? What is the function? Why would a knight spend the equivalent of his entire annual income, if not more, on one of these monuments? Sometimes double the annual income is what these things cost. 40 or so pounds in the early 15th century for a monument like this. That's a lot of money. By comparison, a decent armor, not the best, but a pretty good armor, tended to cost between 5 and 8 pounds. And a carved alabaster monument is between 20 and 40 usually. People can look at these things in churches and be forgiven for taking them for glorified tombstones, right? A kind of a statement or record of who this person was and their life in the world. I suppose they have that function, but they're not tombstones, not first and foremost. Another function of an effigy is to take the physical place in the world of a dead person. When someone dies, they're no longer physically present. They leave a physical gap in the world, and it can be very disconcerting. You're looking around thinking, where did this person go? They were here yesterday and now they're gone, and that's it. They don't exist anymore. And for people certainly for aristocratic people, whose power is vested in these individuals, and whose long-term power and dynasty is traced through successive generations of noble families, it's important that these people remain present physically after death. So it has that function, but that's not the main function either. Ultimately, the most important reason for being that an effigy has is as what Nigel Saul called a spur for intercessionary prayer. And this is medieval Christianity believes that the prayers of the living can help speed a soul through purgatory. That a soul has to burn in the cleansing fires of purgatory, a hell-like place, before it can ascend to heaven. And different souls can spend different amounts of time in purgatory, and a soul can expect to spend thousands of years in purgatory potentially. But the prayers of the living can cut your time basically. And it's very clear that that's what the effigies are. The effigies are pleas for you when you go into the church to pray for the soul of this person. And it's very literal. It's for these people, it's not an abstract concept. This is how the real universe works, and it's just as real as the material world. So the effigy is there to generate those intercessionary prayers. And they're usually, a lot of times effigies are built as part of a larger building project within the church. So like the deceased person or the person before death will build a whole chantry chapel within the church, which is a place specifically dedicated to giving prayers for the dead. And a colleague of mine at a conference explained that also the lifelike quality of the effigy, how well does it simulate this person in life? That has an effect on how how effective the intercessionary prayers are. It's like a lens for those intercessionary prayers. So the better quality the effigy, the more lifelike it is, you know, the more it can have that spooky moment when you go into a church that has no electric light or anything, and you see this thing lying there, and there's a moment when you're not sure, is it a real person or is it a sculpture? Funny stuff like that can happen in dark churches. I've had a few scary moments. um, and that then they've got you. You know, if they, what is art? Art is artifice, right? Art is the creation of an illusion.
Yeah.
A Holbein portrait is not Henry VIII in the room with you. It's egg and pigment smeared on a piece of wood, right? But the artifice, the artist creates this illusion that there's this person in the room with you. And effigies are kind of like that as well. So if they achieve that, if they give you a true, tangible sense of who this person really was physically, then those intercessionary prayers are really gonna kick in. This is an art form that will literally save your soul. But that's why, also getting back to armor, that's why we can really start to trust the carvers. You know, we still have to look at them critically, obviously, and it's not like they get everything right all the time, but the nature of the impulse behind this artistic process means that they really care about rendering the armor and the equipment and everything else as well as they possibly can. Now, different artists have different levels of skill, but you know, we can, even though there's no English armor surviving, as I've documented in my book, and we rely on the effigies, we can establish their accuracy in other ways. There are a small group of effigies in England that represent Italian armor, for example. And here, of course, we've got actual Italian armor surviving that we can compare them to. And we can get a good sense of what these English carvers are about using that approach. You know, you look at them, and again, like, look at this one. This is the charmingly named Sir Thomas Who, Lord Who of Who, and Hastings. He died in the 1450s. His effigy wasn't made later than about 1460. It was then reused as a Tudor monument much later, leading to much confusion. But he is wearing an Italian armor very similar to the earliest of the harnesses preserved in Mantova. And you know, you can look at little details like I don't know if you can see my pointer there, but you know, just like that typical diagonal ridge that you get on the reinforces of Italian pauldrons. You've got that diagonal ridge, and the carver's showing off because, of course, he's got to have the heraldic surcoat, but he's showing you how the armor is pushing the cloth up, and he's clearly working from something real. And even when you go down to little details, you know, it's like an ancient myth or story. It's like Gilgamesh or something. The meaning of those stories is always in the tiny little weird details. And you look at the details of an effigy, things like Italian armor hinges. They're there in reality. They're there on the effigies. You know, like another typical things of Italian armor. The Italians like to nibble. In the 15th century, they like to nibble the edges of the leathers on the lunettes and things that are attached to the armor, so you can tie it onto the arming doublet, and things like the typical Italian strap rivets that are filed with this kind of starburst pattern. Those are the nibbling on the leathers and those rivets, very, very typical of Italian armor in the 15th century. And hey presto, the English effigies have got detail even down to that kind of level. And you know, it's very clear that the effigy carvers are armor literate, and in many cases they're working from real armors that they have in their possession. Where those armors came from or who they belong to is a different issue. And it's interesting, but my main priority is to show that that the carvers have immediate personal contact and interaction with real armor that's then recorded in their work. And and even though there's no English armor surviving, there are ways of interrogating the English effigies that start to give you a lot more confidence too, especially if you're an armor user and you know how armor behaves over time and what happens to it. Let's take this effigy, for example, in the south of Yorkshire. I want to focus your attention now on the tasset straps, okay? So if we look at the tasset straps, and really all the straps on this armor, Thornhill, the English love these little ring pendants. They have a strap end, and then there's a little pendant ring on the end of the strap. And it's just a little dangly, sparkly. It gives the armor just a little bit more of a kind of, goldsmithing, jewelry kind of quality. And there are surviving examples in English excavations. This is one in the Museum of London. These pendant ring strap ends are a thing, right? And all of the straps on this armor have these pendant rings, except for that one, which is a little kind of six-sided polygon. It's not a badly carved ring, because he's carved the rings just fine elsewhere on the armor. This is an odd strap end. And even if you're dubious about what that's supposed to be, how about that one? There's another odd tasset strap that has a little triangular pendant on it, but just one on the whole armor. Here's another example of another idiosyncrasy. These idiosyncrasies are all over the English effigies, but they're never repeated quite in the same way. They're always subtly different. Here we are in Greystoke in Cumbria, effigy of about 1440. Very dramatic English style of the 1440s that I reconstructed on one of my own armors. And now here, I'd like to, in this period in the 1430s and 40s, the English still retain side straps on the placard and lower back plate. These straps right here. The Italians very quickly got rid of those and just hang the lower cuirass on a single strap front and back. But the English retained those side straps for somewhat longer. So you can see that you've got a side strap on the back plate, and you've got a side strap on the breastplate on the side, right? And then you've got the hinges down the middle, right? And then the straps on the other side, okay? It's color coded so you can follow along if you're not quite so familiar with armor of this period. So on the green side, this is on the strapping side of the armor. Here's the side strap on the front, and there's the side strap on the back. Now there's a join of the cuirass right down here that the artist hasn't shown us, but that's what's going on there. And you can see that the straps match each other, right? And they match a lot of the other straps on the armor elsewhere. And you've got these little cross-hatched strap ends and decorated strap plates with the buckle tongue going through. It's very attractive. And then on the other side, something crazy is going on. There's the hinge that the hinge attaches the placard to the lower back plate. Not only do these straps not match the ones on the other side, they don't match each other either. One is much narrower, and it's got a different thing going on with the metalwork. And then you got this big fat strap on the back with this big crazy strap end. What's with that, right? You might ask. This is one of my favorite examples of such idiosyncrasies. This is in Aston in Birmingham. Aston used to be a separate little medieval town, but then it got kind of swallowed up by the industrial age Birmingham. Aston is also, it's a beautiful medieval church with a number of very fine effigies. Aston's also where Ozzy Osbourne comes from, incidentally. There's metal fans out there. So I want to focus your attention here on on the greave hinges, okay? So the greave hinges on this effigy are pretty typical. You've got two little rivets on the front, and you've got one rivet on the back. So the hinge is stable, but it's got a little bit of play on that back rivet, just a little bit. Sometimes you want that on a greave, right? And then around the location of the rivet, you've got it cut out, and there's a bit of file decoration and this sort of double lobe thing going on. It's a purposefully made thing to the function that it has. But then on the other side, you've got this. It's just some nasty little hinge with, just an oblong shape and one rivet on each side, when all the other hinges match the first example. And this one, I love this one because we have a comparison with an actual armor here. Basically my favorite armor ever, actually. So we pop across to the to northern Italy, in the mountains in the Vischgau Valley at Coburg Castle, which armor fans usually are more than aware of. If we pursue our way through Coburg Castle to the armory, and specifically to the surviving parts of the field armor of Gaudens von Matsch, who's a very famous and important member of this family that still hold the castle, well, sort of hold the castle today. It's the traps now, but the traps were relatives of the Matches, and when Gaudens von Matsch didn't have any male issue, the lands and titles and castles passed to their relatives, the traps. And the traps are still there now. I had tea with Countess Trap yesterday, in fact. And so this is getting off the subject. This is the field armor of Gaudens von Matsch. Fabulous thing. He probably wore it in battle against the Venetians in 1487. And anyway, if you look at his greave hinges, he's got the same thing, right? He's got the two rivets on the front and one on the back, and you've got that very purposeful greave hinge design. And then, hey presto, on the other side, he's got one of those as well. I love that. It's great. So I mean,
would there have been any practical reason for that, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the next question. What are all these idiosyncrasies about, right? I think a lot of armor users will be able to speak to this pretty readily. I mean, I've been fighting in armor for 30 years or more, and I've watched the effects of combat, over several years on my armor and on the armor of my friends. And, straps break and hinges, stuff can bust, and weird things happen when a horse falls on top of you, and sometimes when you're in the field, you have to fix it with whatever you've got. And the armor you brought with you to Switzerland doesn't have a bunch of matching hinges for everybody's armor. He's got some hinges and he's got a few buckles, and the random strap that he sticks on there will get you through the tournament or whatever. But my point is that armors often can, they develop these idiosyncrasies as they are used. And I think what the effigy carvers are doing is they've been instructed in many cases to copy real armors just as they are. And I think that, those idiosyncrasies are badges of honor in a way, because they express the fact that something has been done in this armor. If you have a totally pristine, perfect armor, you've clearly never done anything with it. And I wonder if there's some expressive aspect to this, or it's just the fact that they were copying real armor and that's what they ended up with.
I think it could be also a really interesting insight into the medieval knight armored fighters mindset of, modernly we tend to think of armor as like this revered object, it was a status symbol, it was this, and showing things like this, it was a tool. It was something to be used, and it wasn't something that they were constantly like, because he could have very well gone back and said, okay, that worked in the field, but I need you to fix it to make the hinges look the same again.
Mhm.
But he didn't. He just said, it works. I
Get a
can
hinge on
continue
there.
using it.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's still a lot more to understand about the relationship that people had with their armor. You know, I was very struck to find uh, that in military campaigns, very frequently, a lot of the people who fought in full plate armor, uh, the full plate armor wearing class is a very diverse one. It's not just knights. There are lots of different fighting men who end up serving in full plate armor. And so many of them couldn't afford to keep the armor when they're not using it. They buy an armor for a military campaign, but then you have a lot of money tied up in something, and they can't necessarily afford to keep it just to set it up in their house or whatever. They sell it, and then they get another one if they need it, if they need to serve on another military campaign. We forget how much of a person's resources could be tied up in this equipment. So so in the end, after all of this, I wrote up my PhD and passed it in 2004, and I was able to show that a detailed study of the effigies allows you to reconstruct a pretty clear and detailed model of the real functioning equipment, and to show that it is rapidly. I put my finger on the wrong thing there. Excuse me. Yeah, where was I? That it develops very rapidly, decade by decade. The rate at which armor is evolving is really something that really struck me. Decade by decade, it's constantly. Certainly, war equipment is under a lot of pressure to evolve. Evolution is all about pressures, right? The need to be able to do a job better, to survive. And by the 1440s, you see that, quite apart from the aesthetic considerations, the English had developed a technical armor system that was optimized very much for their mode of fighting. That in the second half of the 14th century, the English had developed a very distinct set of tactics, initially to fight the Scots, mind you, and then evolving their tactics to fight the French in the Hundred Years' War, and the Scots as well, of course, and dismounting and having their men at arms and their knights fight on foot in close concert with large numbers of archers was their formula. So they needed to optimize their armor for fighting on foot rather than on horseback. And amazingly, this is what we see on the effigies. We see these armors that have been carefully tweaked over the sort of first 50 years or so of the 15th century to get better and better at finding the perfect balance of mobility and protection for what infantry combat of this specific form requires. And there are a number of variations on that essential theme. And this was the point here where I stopped with the first book of the English Armor Project, and my poor readers had to wait for what it turned out to be 6 years before they could find out what happened next. I shortly after the publication of the first book, I went on a YouTube interview with Matt Easton at Schola Gladiatoria, and he said, "Okay, when's part 2? Because first half of the 15th century is great, but everybody really wants to know about the Wars of the Roses, right? Where's that 1450 to 1500 book?" And I said, it'll probably be out in 2016, 2017 tops, but I promise you it will definitely be no later than 2019. Very latest, and it's 2021. That's when it happened. That's at least, hey, better late than never. So the first book got us that far. And amazing to me that, I like to step back and I like to look at, the bigger picture of where these styles have come from and arrange the drawings in different ways and try and look at them in different ways. And it's just such a wonderful evolutionary progression. It's like a window into the minds of these people. What problems were they wrestling with? What priorities did they have? It's just fascinating to me to see it this way. And that's not a perception of armor that you can get from just looking at the surviving objects, which are in one way or another in a fragmentary state. Also, just on this point about foot combat, I was really struck by the fact that when you arrive at this fully optimized English armor for fighting on foot, that there are a number of key features to this that really define the style. First is a great bassinet, very heavily fortified. It's like a head fortification. It's like, there's a sort of gun turret on your head or something, and really strong protection for the face, for the neck. That's going to get a lot of abuse in the front line of a battle. And while you are actively defending yourself to an extent, the men at arms in the front ranks are going to get hit a lot, and the equipment takes account of that. Another hugely important aspect of the style is symmetrical limb defenses. Fighting on foot with things like axes and spears and two-handed swords. This is a symmetrical martial art. You're striking in any way. You need both sides of your body to be fully mobile, right? You don't get the kind of asymmetrical designs that you get, for example, on Italian armors, which are prioritizing cavalry fighting. Then you have a cuirass that has a longer skirt. Lengthening the skirt gives a lot more protection to the pelvis, to the groin, to the upper legs. And it's just part of what you want for fighting on foot, really. And also fully enclosed leg defenses, fully enclosed upper legs as well as lower legs. And often you have the male voiders at the back of the knees there as well. And then finally, you've got sabatons that don't really overlap very much with the greave. They're cut low around the ankle, so the foot maintains pretty much full mobility in the ankle joint in all directions. Whereas a lot of continental sabatons, they usually have tongue plates that go up inside the greave to maintain the plate overlap and things. So those are the key ingredients: great bassinet, symmetrical limb defenses, the long skirt, the fully enclosed legs, and the free moving sabatons. And I just thought it was fascinating that job description is exactly what we see on very late 15th and early 16th century foot combat armors that are designed for formal tournament foot combat. They have all the same. It's rendered in a slightly different way, but you got the great bassinet, symmetrical arms and shoulders, long skirt turning into the famous tonlet of the early 16th century, enclosed cuisses, and sabatons that don't interact with the greaves.
Now, anybody who has followed you for a while, looking at the illustrations there, would probably recognize that suit, though, because that looks remarkably like your old black suit of armor.
The one in the drawings?
Yes, in the drawings.
Yeah, I mean, it's not my old one. It's but my old one is dealing with these same themes.
Yeah.
This is artwork from my the first English armor book, English Knight book. Some of the illustrations by Jeff Wasson, the great armorer of Long Island.
Yeah.
And Jeff and I, of course, worked together for years. And also the blueprint drawings that I was showing you earlier are the work of Robert McPherson, the great armorer of Philadelphia.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how much pleasure and satisfaction it gives me that both of the illustrators of these books are two of the best armorers in the world. It just gives the artwork that extra level of authority, and it made all kinds of things possible for the book that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. That if I was working with a general illustrator and having to explain every little thing and correct mechanical errors in the drawings, this never would have come together. It just couldn't have. And also, while they're doing their artwork, they're bringing questions back to me and saying, yeah, but what about this? You didn't say anything about the fact that on this effigy, there's a strap going around the back, but then there are buckles on the outside and there's nothing on the other side. So what's up with that? And I didn't notice that. And I have to go back and rewrite chapter 3 because something has come up. But ultimately, that process means that the artwork has really integrated with the text of these books because of that collaboration with the illustrators who are also armorers. And Robert McPherson, of course, who did the blueprint drawings, also made my black and gold armor. Yeah. Which is covered in the appendix of book 1. So, this is a 25-year project, as I said, and it also represents 25-year relationships or 30-year relationships with people I'm collaborating with. So again, now the story doesn't end in 1450. The 100 Years' War ends, and the English now are in a completely different military environment where they're fighting each other. And their old tactics don't work on each other because their enemy knows all their tricks, because their enemy is themselves. So there's new evolutionary pressures on English armor in the second half of the 15th century. And just as we did in the first book, we follow in the second book, which just came out last October, the print run actually is already half sold out, which is amazing to me, because the first English armor book, book 1, took 6 years to sell out. It only just sold out in like the last few months. Book 2 is already half gone, which is, I think, a good sign that the stuff is being well received now. Anyway, so we carry on through into the great age of, the Yorkist age and 100 years, the Wars of the Roses. But what we're seeing now is the need to still have armors that are effective for fighting on foot, but the English are now getting back on their horses more often. And there's a lot more fighting in the Wars of the Roses that's done by knights on horseback. And by the end of the 15th century, look where you've ended up. You have it's not totally as asymmetric and heavily optimized for cavalry fighting as an Italian armor, but it's very much heading in that direction. And and really, let's see. After those battles in the 1470s of the Wars of the Roses, when Edward IV, took back the crown at Barnet and Tewkesbury, those were the last major infantry combats. I mean, at Bosworth, the Duke of Norfolk deployed his army and his men-at-arms on foot, but Richard III deployed on horseback in a cavalry charge. And as far as we can tell, at the Battle of Stoke in 1487, pretty much all of the knights fought as heavy cavalry. So that age, the great, the English way of war in the 14th and early 15th centuries is kind of over by the end of the 15th century. So, and that's a story of military history, but it's also the story that the armor on the effigies tells. And that's when I start to feel like I'm on the right track. When different kinds of evidence in radically different media tell you the same story. you know, then you feel like you're getting towards some kind of reality. And just to put them all on one line, you know, again, stepping back a little bit, that's the whole story, basically, of the first two books, of book one and book two. And you could just stare at that for ages, actually, seeing all the funny little things that are going on with these armors. But that's not the end of the story, of course. I didn't intend to write a book three. But I thought I was going to finish the whole project with book two. And I wrote it all, and all my work was going into a single book two. Until fairly late, I was getting close to preparing the text for submission to the designer. And I thought to myself, you know, this seems really long. I better just do a word count check, which I hadn't done in months and months and months. I do a word count check and see where I am. And the word count for a 320-page Armor of the English Knight book is around 55,000 words. And because it's heavily illustrated as well. And what I was looking at was more like 125,000 words. And I realized, holy moly, I'm having twins. You know, yeah, that was my thought. I've got another book here and I didn't even know it. So the third and final book deals with this issue, the issue of the presence of foreign armor in England.
Oh, neat.
This whole issue was a 10-page appendix in my PhD, looking at the few effigies that show us Italian armor, but I didn't pursue it beyond that. And now I felt in a published form, which is, you know, dealing much more expansively with a history of armor in England, I need to really, really dig down into the presence of foreign equipment in England, which is really only traceable from 1435. So the chronology of the third book is 1435 to 1500. So at the moment, we've got two books. A few months from now, the third one will be well on its way. My deadline for all images and final text is the end of March of this year. Design of the third book will begin in April, and release will be in October time, I hope.
Nice.
So that's that, really. We got a bit of time for questions if anybody wants to bring anything up. Or,
I'm sure people would love to ask you questions.
Yeah, sure.
Does anybody have any?
If you want to, I mean, maybe it looks like there's stuff going on into the chat. Matt, maybe you can look through the chat.
Yeah, sure.
And then just yell some questions out from there, perhaps.
Let's see. Let me go back to the beginning here, Caesar. Chad Becker brought up a point about how the effigy seems, the point you're talking about, the prayer and the seems intrinsically linked to the important saintly effigies in Catholicism and their intercession as well, about how praying to saints could intercede for as well, but you could literally pray directly for somebody by standing next to them. I mean,
yeah. I mean, a lot of the appeals to patron saints is sort of appeals of the living. I'm not sure how much interaction saints are supposed to have with departed souls. Saints are very much, their job is to intercede and act as arbiters between the living on earth and the heavenly powers themselves. So they have a slightly different role in all of this, but you know, their iconography of manifesting as armored warriors is hugely important too. And of course, part of St. George's popularity in the Middle Ages, in England especially, derived from his habit of manifesting physically on battlefields to save the people who prayed to him. Famously manifesting at the siege of Acre, I think it was Acre, and also at Agincourt. There's several of the accounts say that St. George was seen on the battlefield at Agincourt fighting for the English, which is, I guess it's a good justification for losing if you're on the French side.
Someone asked if there was a heightened attention to realism in the effigies after the Black Death. So they're reminded of the transy tombs.
Yes, I mean, the whole iconography of effigies more generally is very complicated, and there's a number of different kinds, and there are different genres of effigies at in different periods that are trying to achieve different things. So, for example, in the 14th century, you have that fashion for effigies who are starting to get up, or they're propping themselves up on their elbows, and then it looks like they're about to get up. But that's, again, a reference to the to the resurrection and so forth. But it's also a desire to find artistic conventions that will give the effigy this lifelike quality in the environment of the church. When like 13th century effigies have their legs crossed and they're drawing their swords, that's just about trying to find a composition that gives us kind of dynamism and lifelike quality to a stone figure.
This is a question from myself here. Did you focus mostly on like the alabaster effigies, correct?
I looked at everything.
You looked at everything.
The alabaster ones are easier to find because they tend to get mentioned more in old publications and things. But I also found a number that are in other materials that are carved in sandstone or clunch, which is like chalk. It's a kind of chalk, basically. So there are effigies carved in other materials. They're generally artistically inferior to the alabaster ones. But those inferior works are often really important to look at as well, because sometimes, as a colleague of mine put it, he said, sometimes the inferior carvers take refuge in technical detail. They might not be able to carve a face, but by God, they're going to make those hinges look like they're in the right place, And I found some really striking little details on effigies of really quite modest quality that I don't find anywhere else, and that, were really meaningful.
Let's see what else we have here. Somebody asked, likened the bands of the Fald to the asking if it was like the Roman Lorica Segmentata, that they collapsed into each other, asking if they collapse into each other to allow for flexibility, or if that whole lower Fald is rigid.
No, they generally are hanging on leathers, so they can collapse in and out, or they can move in different ways. They can kick up at the front or the back, or they're very, very movable, just like a Lorica Segmentata. Yeah.
Let's see here. Why do placards appear later in England than in Mediterranean Europe? Interesting question.
Sorry, run that one again for me.
It says, why do placards appear later in England than Mediterranean Europe?
Oh yeah, why? They're not that much behind. I mean, the earliest sort of two-part cuirasses with a placard and things appear in England in about 1430. And you could, and whenever you say about this date or that date, you've got to allow for a little bit of slide, 5 years one way or the other. So, it's conceivable that the English knew about them in the 1420s. And, that's not that far from the earliest evidence that we have for them in Italy, really. What's 10 or 15 years, really? And actually, I've been really struck, especially in the third book, by actually how fast people in Western Europe and in England can find out about innovations that have happened on the other side of Europe. I give you an example. a really striking example at the end of the 15th century where you get the greave is lengthened a bit to head down towards the floor at the back, covering the heel. And then the sabaton is integrated as a single assembly, articulated off the front of the greave. So they're no longer wearing the sabaton as a separate thing. It's, you know, it's a part, it's an integral system with the greave. Absolutely the earliest evidence for that is on a child's armor made in Innsbruck in 1488. It's datable very precisely. And then there are two slightly more advanced versions of that system, one made in Innsbruck and one made in either the Netherlands or Spain in about 1490. And then already, no later than 1495, the English have got the system and they're working on it, and they're making it in they're making their own versions of it in a couple of different ways. And that's really fast, actually. That a new thing can be transmitted and all these people have to find out about it, and it's already so familiar that it's appearing on the monuments only less than 10 years after the earliest invention, as far as we can tell.
Well, we've only got time for one last question, but you've already answered the question that I'm asking everyone, which is, what is your favorite armor? So,
Oh yeah.
but somebody actually gave me a really good idea. Since you've already mentioned your armor, can you share your top 3 effigies that you looked at so far?
That's a hard one. I mean, there are many fascinating examples, and they're interesting for a lot of different reasons. And how do you choose one or another? I mean, they can be wonderful for lots of different reasons. And I mean, I'd have to say, well, I need to have a favorite within a particular period or something. I mean, you can't deny the absolute glory of the gilt, the gilt bronze effigy of Sir Richard Beauchamp at Warwick. And that's probably the most famous of all English effigies. And it's the only one of a man in armor of the 15th century. The only other one is the Black Prince, that's done in that gilt bronze or gilt copper alloy medium, and shows armor. But the Beauchamp one is pretty, in many ways, hard to beat. But another favorite of mine is the one that I showed you with the Royal Armory slide at the very beginning. It was made for a member of the Green family. We're not quite sure which member of the family, but it shows a Burgundian. I'm calling the style the Western European fluted style, very specific to the Burgundians, really, but a small number of them appear in England. And it's Italianate, but then it's got a lot of fluted spikiness going on. And the one that I'm referring to, it's in a little place called Greens Norton in England, and it's very banged up. It's got its legs broken off. There's a piece of the foot lying nearby, very heavily graffitied and so forth. But that one's always attracted my admiration. And it's hard to know why they do sometimes, but they're all great. They're all great in different ways.
Well, Dr. Capwell, thank you so much for joining us today and giving us this look of the process going into your next books. Certainly, where can we find your books if we'd like to purchase one?
Yeah, really the only places to get it. It's a sort of exercise in guerrilla publishing, really. You can order it directly from the publisher, Thomas Delmar, who runs a company called Olympia Auctions. He runs, Arms and Armor auctions, and the story of how he became a publisher with me is another long and painful one. Well, he galloped to the rescue. I had about 5 negotiations over about 10 years with 5 or 6 different major publishers, and the talks fell through all at different points for different reasons. And in 2014, I was despairing that this project would ever happen. and I was basically about to give up on the whole thing. And then Tom came along and said, "This is ridiculous. We should just do it ourselves." And I said, what are you, crazy? What are you talking about? He said, no, I do 2 exhibition catalogs a year. I've got designers, I've got printers, I've got an office full of people to help us. Let's just do it ourselves. So that's what we did. So you can order it directly from him, or you can get it from the Wallace Collection shop, which has an online outlet. And that's about it. I mean, there's people scalping copies all over the place for hundreds of pounds. I don't sometimes know how to feel about that. If they think they can get it, great, I guess. Book 1 is basically gone now. I don't think the publisher or the Wallace Collection have any more now. I think they're gone. But book 2 is half gone. I think we've sold something like 1,300 of the print run of 2,500. Well done, Evan. I'm glad you got one.
Yeah.
Well done. It isn't impossible that we might at some point do like a paperback run of all 3 books, as a box set somewhere down the line. It's a vague possibility. The main barrier against it is that we would have to relicense all the images, which is not only an enormous amount of work, it's an enormous amount of money. And I gathered the money for the image licensing and everything over a period of 10 or more years, whereas reprinting all 3 as a set would be a major investment. I'm not saying it won't happen, but it's tricky.
All right. Well, we're out of time for this session, but thank you again so much for joining us today. It was a fascinating talk.
My pleasure. Yeah.
Our next session up is going to be a replay of last year's session of Ben Bruce and Reese Nelson's talk on harness fashion. So you can all tune in to watch that if you'd like. If not, we'll be back at 1 with, I can tell you with who, with Fred Schulp of Jamestown. So thank you all.